If we want to keep enhancing our capability with data, AI, stay competitive globally, it's going to take an enormous amount of electricity.
The grid is under pressure like never before. It's no longer just a technical challenge. It's a regulatory one. Under Scott's watch, APPA is actively sounding the alarm on the need for timely, sensible permitting reform.
Keeping the system viable. If a transmission project crosses federal land, you're talking about significant process to try to get permission just to do that. As you have bottlenecks, you have price increases, and that impacts folks too. We're not keeping up with the demand right now.
Scott Corwin, welcome to Energy Essentials Power Perspectives podcast.
Thanks, Jason and Matt. Great to be with you today.
And we're thrilled to have you. So let's take it from the start. Give us a big picture. Why is permitting reform such a front burner issue for public power, specifically right now?
Yes. Well, those 2,000 communities that are part of the public power family across the country in 49 states and 5 territories, there's a lot of diversity from some of the largest cities in the country to some of the smallest towns. Each one of them is focused on that affordability and reliability for those members of the community and the electricity they serve. And if you're going to maintain that system to retain reliability and affordability, being able to get things done efficiently through the permitting process is pretty critical. So there's a need to build infrastructure, to stay safe, to stay reliable. But that balance of reasonable environmental review with making sure that we're able to maintain the system without years of delay and exorbitant cost is pretty critical. And it's gotten even more so recently.
Yeah, for sure. And those delays are described in the form of permitting challenges, siting landscape, just basically the challenges of where this all goes. So talk to us, what are some of the common friction points public power utilities are facing when it comes to these?
One of the biggest impacts actually, or the result of this process and the status of it now, is a lack of planning certainty. So if you're going to invest large dollars and be able to move efficiently, you need reasonable lead time. You need ability to know what you can rely on for process and timelines. So that extended timeline is pretty arduous. The cost that it adds, the layers of regulation, both with multiple federal agencies or even within a single federal agency, and then state and local agencies, also adds difficulty. You end up with a lot of studies, a lot of reviews of studies, a lot of consultants and multiple parties involved. So there's staffing costs, and it's numerous laws, that are part of those friction points. Just on the federal side, you have NEPA, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the statutes for nuclear permitting, the statutes for hydro licensing under the Federal Power Act, and others. So it's quite a maze to navigate through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my understanding with NEPA alone, it could be, you're already adding in the metric of years, if not a whole decade, to get through that process. So how about this? Walk us through some real world examples of how permitting delays, members of the APPA, whether it's a new generation or a transmission upgrade or a reliability project. So give us an example of that. And then how is your organization playing a role in all this?
Yeah, thank you. I'll get to, we play a role in multiple ways. But on the impacts, it's kind of all of the above that you just mentioned. So there's certainly generation, transmission, reliability projects. It's also just even the most basic maintenance, keeping the system viable. So when you think about something like vegetation management, just trying to keep the trees off the lines. If a transmission project crosses federal land, it could be multiple owners on the federal side. You're talking about significant process to try to get permission just to do that basic maintenance or take out a hazard tree. And this has been a challenge over time. Anytime that kicks in, it can impact reliability. It can impact wildfire risk, for example. And that I mentioned relicensing, for example, just with current generation. So again, not a new project, but take a hydro project that's been sitting there for 50 years. It could take a decade or more just to get the relicensing done on that. Nuclear, same thing. So The impacts are many, even before you start talking about new generation or siting new projects. When you're looking at emissions impacts, air impacts, water impacts, the water, there doesn't need to be a federal nexus necessarily for it to kick in. The states implement provisions of the Clean Water Act. If there is a federal nexus, you mentioned NEPA. When you get into the environmental assessment on that and the studies and the cost to get to the environmental impact statement, it can really stretch out. So the impacts are many, including when you stretch out the timelines like that, it impacts your supply chain costs as well, because cost and availability of the materials and labor relatively, they don't get easier as the timelines stretch. Transmission projects cover such broad areas, some of them, hundreds of miles across multiple jurisdictions, very tough to site and permit. And even if you're not involved with the project directly, you can be impacted. So the impacts hit utilities across any area as reliability of the system is reduced. They can see that impact. And this is happening, simultaneous with some plants being retired, certainly coal plants and others, major weather events that can impact reliability as well. So you have a combination of things. And NERC has been warning us about this for the last few years, that during those winter peaks and summer peaks, and now in multiple regions, there's significant increased cost of outages. So the impacts matter, and you see it on timelines, you see it on cost, you see it on reliability, and then across the whole system, as you have supply and demand pressures, as you're not able to get new generation and transmission in, obviously energy availability, certainly in peak hours. As you have bottlenecks, you have price increases, and that impacts folks too. We've advocated on the legislative side, on the regulatory side at APPA, but we also lend technical and operations support. We have groups where they can share tips with each other on how to approach this. We have sessions that we host on legal and regulatory seminars. We have reliability certification programs where folks can see what best practices are to try to address some of these issues for their systems. So a lot of different ways in the education and training and support side, but certainly on the legal and being in the middle of the regulatory processes here in DC.
Yeah, that's helpful. So when you're having these conversations with your members, what are they thinking? What are they saying? And how are they thinking about, this demand in electrification? And a conversation would not be complete if we don't talk about AI, data centers, and the shift and change in population growth. So, knowing that you've got this long timeline and yet you've got this demand that's needed now to satisfy, what are the conversations like?
That's interesting because, as you said, you can't go to a meeting these days without hearing about AI and data center load and the impacts to electricity load growth over time. But it's interesting in the public power realm. We have, like I said, a lot of variety. So we have some areas seeing those impacts much greater than others. But across our membership, there's a lot of increased focus on strategic planning, on resource planning, on trying to stay nimble and flexible where you can, even as you're making investments in your system. There's a host of other, things that they discuss when we hold sessions on this, especially as you see those large load inquiries coming into a community. They work with local agencies, including economic development, other folks, to try to gauge the pros and cons of those loads when they're coming in, and how you address that. They're staffing up internally where needed, again, on this permitting side of it, to create the expertise and the needed relationships with federal and state agencies, and then also ability to do the analysis on how it's going to impact your system and what contract provisions you need to have in place to determine who's going to take on which costs and whether your system can support. And especially in those cases, there's a serious discussion that needs to happen around avoiding stranded costs to existing customers if those loads change over time. In some areas, that means there's a large reliance on natural gas, and will be for the foreseeable future. There's a focus on trying to get those permitted. There's a lot of excitement around new nuclear because it's a resource that it's a non-emitting resource that can follow load well, provide grid stability, can meet large load potentially over time. So a lot of different discussions happening around that right now, and on that increased load dynamic.
Scott, we've had environmental defense lawyers on the show. We've interviewed environmentalists, and many of them speak about taking a rational approach. They don't see themselves as a barrier to meeting the changes of what's going on in our electrification drive. And you seem very much aligned with some of what they're saying, given your speeches and some of the things you've written about. You even talked about something called smart permitting reform. What is smart permitting reform? What does it look like? And help us understand that.
We do support reasonable approaches, and in the environmental laws, you've seen they don't tend to change drastically over time, or you don't see major reforms. But smart permitting reform, I think, initiatives, and some are already underway, where you can standardize the way we approach and the way federal agencies approach the process to make it more efficient and more reliable and easier for the agencies themselves and their staff. You see that where you have master agreements that are trying to cover a broader area rather than taking each project, each company one by one and having to redo or restart each time. You see it with nationwide permitting. You see it with just trying to insist and have timelines that you can rely on that are, yes, they should be shorter and can be quicker, but they're also just for clarity and planning, they're more firm. And it compels consistency within the agency as well. So creating that consistency, that reliability, that ability to plan, that's the kind of smarter permitting that we're talking about. Coordination, increased coordination among federal agencies themselves, because sometimes you'll have several involved with the same permitting process over time. Being able to do it concurrently, right, rather than linear step by step that adds time. So limiting the scope helps as well, knowing what your litigation exposure is, and then ensuring staffing and funding at the agencies where it's needed to be able to move the permits through. This does take an adequate level of staffing within the agencies that we're dealing with to make sure that any streamlined permitting still works, because you got to get the things processed.
And I believe that when we think of permitting reform, it's not just a federal issue, it's a state, local, tribal, regional issue as well. Do you have any anecdotes or experiences where you're seeing, say, something enterprising, a solution that's happening in a local community that actually could be scaled to, across the country, and we could learn from that? Any anecdotes you could share with us on that?
Some states started centralizing their permitting functions, which can be really helpful, where you have one stop shopping if you're bringing an energy project in, rather than having to go agency to agency to agency. So centralized permitting, expedited permitting, where they really are focused on moving things along. You saw that actually in the last several years, some where they were trying to incent renewable projects specifically in some of the states. But I think you're seeing broader approaches now in many areas. You're seeing them drop barriers. For example, some states had moratoria against nuclear projects where they've amended that now. And I think public power is in a good position to tell this story because they're part of local governments and they can speak to the other local and state agencies well. They work with them regularly to make sure that they understand the importance, the critical nature of getting this infrastructure maintained and built to again, to preserve that affordability and reliability. And I think it's also education. You can see how it really matters locally for economic development, for maintaining your residents' happiness and ability to function. So, and businesses' capabilities. So, I think there's a lot to be learned from the way state and local governments are looking at this, because they're so directly tied to the end use consumers.
I recall you recently mentioned meeting with Secretary Wright of the DOE to discuss APPA's priorities. So Can you share with us what was the outcome of that conversation? What kind of legislation could possibly be in the works? What did you prioritize? Just how did that conversation go, and where does he see and stand with APPA priorities?
Yeah, thanks. I think what you've seen and what they've said publicly out of the administration and the Department of Energy is there is really a focus on making sure that we have the energy we need moving forward, that we're competitive globally, but also that we retain this reliability and affordability in the United States and ability to serve these big loads coming on. So, and you've seen that in several of their executive orders coming out too, both on energy generally and on permitting specifically. So, having the agencies focused on moving the timelines along, more quickly. You have seen them specifically reference that in some of the executive orders, which could be helpful. Some of that will, potentially anything that can be challenged in court often is, and so some of these things will call out for statutory continue to, be would be better with statutory changes to create that certainty over time and reliability over time, so folks know what they're dealing with, rather than having a different impetus in 4-year cycles, because you can't plan energy projects in 4-year cycles, obviously. Some of that, the focus for us, how do you get at that in these laws that, like I said, they're mostly from the 1970s. They've been rarely amended. I think you got to step back and look at what the reasonable intent is for environmental review, and look at the scope of those fundamental laws, and start to say what is they've been extrapolated and litigated over time, but what's a reasonable approach to where the litigation and the time limits should end, so that you can get a decision and move on. That helps the agencies as well. If they're afraid of making a decision because it's going to be litigated each time, that's not an efficient way to try to do business, either within the federal government or the private sector or public sector trying to get projects built. So some of those, just drawing the sideboards, standardizing again the process. Part of that, is over time on this impetus for permitting reform and legislation has been focused on large scale transmission projects, because they cross so much territory and tend to involve the federal government quite a bit. You can make progress there too, but you're going to need to come up with ways that you can create that certainty and planning and expedited process, but still, for our folks, make sure that those reforms enable needed transmission, but with costs in mind. We've seen a lot of areas where the transmission costs have gone up quite a bit. You don't want to do is get a lot of projects or get overbuilds and get cost allocation that increases costs on customers that aren't really needing to use that portion of the transmission system. So some of those are tough issues, but they go back to timing, certainty, affordability, and reliability. And I think there should be a lot of alignment there. So.
Yeah, those are good points. So when we think of permitting reform, we often think of it as an infrastructure issue. It's delaying jobs, delaying the build out, all the sort of downstream economic factors that come of that. Or there's a permitting reform to help, address some of the climate concerns that we face. But you also talked about affordability and reliability a moment ago. So I want to pull that thread a little bit more. Could you help us help us bridge that gap between permitting reform and what that means from an affordability and reliability standpoint?
Sure. And I can do it and even link in the climate issue that you referenced too. For example, just on the process side, if you take, a nuclear plant, for example, that could provide, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of non-emitting generation that can follow load. It can help balance out other variable forms of renewable generation. If that process was going to take or could take 1 to 2 years and instead takes triple that or more, same with hydro, if you're going to take a decade rather than 2 to 3 years, just that associated tripling of the timelines of the studies of the consultants, of potential litigation, again, supply chain, materials, equipment, labor, all stretching out, that cost has to go into the project or eventually be covered by those purchasing from the project. And that's immediately an affordability issue. The delay is also a reliability issue, like I said, because we're not keeping up with the demand right now. But moreover, that's just the project cost. Moreover, when you look at not being able to add generation to meet demand, especially these really large loads showing up in real time, it creates that supply and demand curve dynamic that I mentioned earlier. So then you've got costs going up as well, just out of the laws of supply and demand and constraint. Delays mean less supply when you really need it, and that lack of transmission to move it where it is needed in real time is a critical part of that. The really big costs at times in energy come in those peak hours during that peak day of that peak week of that peak month. It's not all the time, but it really matters when it hits. And so that's the affordability side. The reliability side at that point creates a real danger to human safety, because that tends to be either the coldest day of the year or the hottest day of the year. Those are some of the real aspects you're facing with what's going on here if we can't keep up on getting these things in place.
Scott, there was recent suggestions from the Trump administration that the TVA may be privatized. I think it's going through a study right now. Any thoughts on or opinions on what that means and how what that would translate into what the TVA of the future might look like?
Yeah, we've seen those proposals over time, and there's a long history of TVA being part of public power in the valley, in that region, and serving the public need there. The customers are publics and co-ops that are consumer-owned, not-for-profit utilities, and that's been the focus of the agency, especially with a large hydro fleet and some nuclear and another other mixture. They are a critical element in the public power world to making sure that the generation and transmission for that area is served and viable. And so tend to come and go, but the history is they've done a really good job just serving the public need and serving public power down in that area.
Well, fantastic, Scott. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and as a leader of up to 2,000 members, that's at least 6,000 opinions. So you're a busy man. But at this point, we're going to shift gears. We're going to give you the final word in a moment, but we're going to shift gears to what we call the lightning round, which gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. So we're going to bring Matt back in, and he's going to throw a set of questions at you, and we ask you to keep your response to one word or phrase.
Excellent, Scott. So what is your preferred way to unwind after a long day?
Biking or walking the dog along the Alexandria waterfront.
Do you have a guilty pleasure movie or TV show or other piece of media that you like to come back to?
Lately, the sort of comedic whodunits, like the murder mystery in the White House called The Residence is fun, or Only Murders in the Building with Steve Martin and Selena Gomez. And so, yeah, fun murders, I guess.
What is your favorite road trip snack? What are you picking up at the gas station?
Yeah, well, most of my travel is on plane these days, but on a real road trip, yeah, at the gas station, I'll go a classic beef jerky or Pringles or almonds, a lot of salt.
One of the things we've been doing is asking previous guests of the show to leave lightning round questions for future guests. So we have one for you from Rusty Williams at UTC, who asked, what is one career mulligan that you would like to take? One thing that, if you look back at your career, you might have wished you'd done differently.
Yeah, I mean, I've been really fortunate, so it's hard to think about a true mulligan in each step of my career. I'd say probably, though, if there were one, it took me about 10 years to find my niche in public or consumer-owned power, and I probably would have made that jump earlier if I'd known about it much, because in my 20s rather than in my 30s. I think it's a wonderful place for young folks to start out and build a career. And I was a little late coming to it.
Now it's your turn to leave any sort of question for a future guest, and it can be on topic about the industry, or it can be completely off the wall.
Sure. Yeah. This is, kind of a crystal ball type one, but I do think it's interesting to see what people think. So 50 years from now, across the global economy, what do they think the top 3 energy fuel sources will be?
All right. And then lastly, what are you most passionate about?
The proper answer is always public power. I am passionate, but it's true because the mission grows on you the longer you work in here and see these local utilities, the local staff, the line workers, the elected officials, all really caring about their communities. So that's the simple answer. How can you not be passionate about bringing affordable, reliable power to communities?
That's great. Well, thank you, Matt. And Scott, we granted you the final word, so knowing you have an audience of energy professionals at Energy Central listening in today's show, what are some takeaways or perhaps action items you'd hope your listeners get motivated with and perhaps carry to their day at work or into their future?
Yeah, thank you. I think, out of this discussion, if we want to keep enhancing our capability with data, AI, electronics that drive our society, stay competitive globally, it's going to take an enormous amount of electricity. We're seeing those projections play out, not just growth across the economy, but data loads themselves potentially doubling in the next decade. So that's an enormous shift that we have not seen ever, maybe unless you go all the way back to the original electrification as we were building the system. So if we don't get better at creating a balanced approach to reasonable review of environmental and other regulations, our affordability and reliability will suffer. I think we're up to the challenge if we work together. There is still time to turn the ship, to streamline permitting, to keep a reliable service of electricity that we've grown to expect. So let's roll up the sleeves and do it.
I like that. Let's roll up our sleeves. I think we all think about that almost every day for anyone who works in this industry. So no doubt about that. Solid words, Scott. We really appreciate that. And I know that our members are going to have a lot of questions and comments. So I encourage you, Scott, to stay engaged with the Energy Central platform where people will be posting questions and we'll keep that conversation going. I know that you have a busy day today, so I want to thank you for taking time out to share with us your insights. We hope you'll come back maybe a year from now to check in on how things have progressed. And I just want to, again, thank you for sharing your insight in today's episode.
Yeah, I'd love to come back anytime. Thank you very much for having me on today. Appreciate it.
So, Matt, I really enjoyed that conversation with Scott. It seems like a really insightful guy and really knows what he's doing, and I love the passion as well. Well, the question I raised around and the comment he responded around this sort of smart way of approaching permitting is not so inconsistent with what leaders that we've had on the show, from the Environmental Defense Fund to the Environmental Council and other thought leaders in the environmental space who tend to sit on the opposite side of the table. So, they all have a common goal. It's just how you get to it. And I feel like if they could just get into a room and they're given 24 hours to figure it out, they probably could do it in, say, 16 hours. They just need to, they both have a rational approach to addressing this. They all have the same understanding that there needs to be an answer to, modernizing our grid, to more electrification, to protecting the interests of our environment and the people. So why can't we work more rationally? And I think both sides say the same thing. So that part of the conversation stood out for me. What about for you?
I completely agree, Jason, and I think it highlights, maybe it's almost cliche to say, but the role of leadership in all of this. If everybody has more or less the same goals, we're aligned on what we want to see, what we want to deliver for the industry. It's just about, making sure people are talking through that, people are presenting the arguments for it rationally and data-based, and people are listening to each other. And I guess the challenge is if it goes off the rails. The quote from him that I immediately started writing down, thinking about promoting this episode, was, "Hey, anything that can be challenged in court will, and for someone like him. He's like, we can't think about planning energy projects in 4-year cycles based on the whim of one administration or the following one or the following one. It's got to be a long-term thing. And again, I think everybody would agree with that. It's all it does is create inefficiencies in the system. So if we're all on the same page about that, let's make sure rational heads prevail there. And, the risk of the policy side is does it get in the hands of let's say leaders who say, all right, well, we all agree on this, but now we want to attach a little extra something there. That's not on the same page of everything. That's what worries me, that, we'll lose that, what's clearly a rational bipartisan support of we want to fix this. And hopefully, like I said, the leadership steps up to make sure that we get that.
Matt, we always invite our listeners to make suggestions of future guests. So help us understand, like, how could they get in touch with you, and who should they reach out to? What's the email address to let their voices be heard in terms of, either joining the show or making suggestions on how to improve the show or guests to include on the show?
Yeah, you can always get in touch with me at mchester, that's M as in Matt Chester, at energycentral.com. And then the comments on Energy Central are always open. So we'll obviously, if you're listening to this on your podcast app or watching the YouTube video, there'll be a link in the description to take you to where we have a post on energycentral.com featuring this episode. And if you have thoughts, if you have questions for Scott or anything to follow up on this episode or any other ones, leave a comment there and we'll follow up with you in that way too.
Yeah, and I know firsthand that Matt reads those starting at 6 a.m. So he'll respond back to you, no doubt about that. And we thank you for your commitment here, Matt, as always. And of course, thanks again to our sponsor, West Monroe. West Monroe is a leading partner in the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities, working together to drive grid modernization, clean energy, and workforce transformation. West Monroe's comprehensive services are designed to support utilities in advancing their digital transformation, building resilient operations, securing federal funding, and providing regulatory advisory support. With a multidisciplinary team of experts, West Monroe offers a holistic approach that addresses the challenges of the grid today and provides innovative solutions for a sustainable future. And once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com, and we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.